All right. So last week we started this study. I'm going to pull this down. Last week we started a study on the Intertestamental Period. I got a couple questions you don't need to answer. Just think about them. If Jesus came today, would he agree with your religious opinions or would he challenge them? Why do divisions form among people who share the same faith? See, these two questions will be answered through this study today, and we'll see how people of the same faith were divided. So Jesus came into a very religiously diverse and divided world. Even though Judaism was up front and was bold in the New Testament, there are still groups that believed different things and had different opinions on the law, the Torah, the Old Testament. And there were many influences between the Old and the New Testament that changed the landscape for Christ. We talked about last week, Galatians 5:5, that God prepared a way for Christ to come. All of the things we're going to talk about today were prepared so that Christ can come, so that he can be the person that he was and is today. So last week, we talked about the history behind this intertestamental period, all the kingdoms that came, all the rulers, all the things that happened historically and politically. Well, today, we're going to talk about the religious movements, what came and influenced Judaism, the Jews, and what helped Christ to spread his message, spread the gospel. And we'll talk about that today. To start, though, I want to talk about Old Testament Judaism. This is what the Old Testament said about the law and what the Jews followed, because we need to know a basis before we go on for the influences. Kind of like how, in science classes, you have to have your base setting before you do any of the experiments. This is our base. Here's the basics of Judaism. They centered on the covenant with God, the relationship with God, the promises that he made with Abraham and all the other leaders of the Jewish religion. Temple worship was only in Jerusalem. There's only that temple where they can worship at. They had priesthood and sacrifices. We see this in Leviticus. All the laws that gladly we don't have to follow nowadays. We have the law of Moses. That first 5 books that he wrote, that's the law that they followed. The festivals and feasts, they had Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, Day of Atonement, which shaped their religious life, how they lived day by day, how they, all the things that they had their calendar year. We have 4th of July. And when 4th of July comes around, we cook hot dogs, we set fireworks off, we do all that stuff. They had the same things. They had Passover. They had to prepare for that. And so these were things that shaped their lives. We have the prophets. After Malachi, there's no other prophet until John the Baptist. But they guided the nation. They called them back to a covenant of faithfulness with God. And they were also a united identity. Even though there's 2 nations, the North and the South, even though they seem divided, they're still united in the fact that they followed the law. They followed the same religion. And we'll see that changes with certain influences. And by the way, I have 15 pages of notes. We're probably not going to get through it all, but I will make sure that y'all get out at 6 o'clock. We might have to continue this next time we meet, because next week it will be youth-led. So the week after that, we might have to continue what I don't get through today. But the first big influence that came amongst the people, Persia, there were some influences, but there's nothing noteworthy for this class. I can go in very small details, but I'm not going to because I already got a lot. So Hellenism, the Greeks, huge influence on the Jewish people and Jewish religion. So what is Hellenism? Well, Hellenism refers to the spread of the Greek language, culture, philosophy, and lifestyle that began with Alexander the Great and continued through all the Hellenistic kingdoms that came after him, and then also into the Roman Empire. The term comes from Hellas, which is Greek for Greece. So it has nothing to do with hell. It has to do with the name of Greece. It's the Greek culture, Hellenism. Nothing to do with hell. I believed that when I was younger. It was Hellenism, but no, it's Greek culture. But it blended, Hellenism blended Greek traditions with local cultures. So not just Judaism. There's, Oriental cultures that were then changed to be more like Greek. There was all these different cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean that were influenced by Hellenism. So it had a huge spread on the world. In 334 to 323 BC, we see the conquest of Alexander the Great. I talked about history last week, so we're not going to get too deep into this. But he came through and he conquered the Persian Empire. So he changed the Persian culture. He changed Judea, and he brought in Greek institutions, art, architecture, and different ideas with polytheism, while Judaism is monotheism. Greek having multiple gods, Jews only had one. We also see the Hellenistic kingdoms. After Alexander the Great died, and there's all these different kingdoms, and they all forced Hellenism in their own way. Some didn't force it, some really forced it. And so the Ptolemies had control over Judea first, and then went to the Seleucids, and that's when Hellenism really started kicking in on Judaism. And then we had the Roman period, and Rome took over Greece, and they kept this Hellenistic culture and continued it throughout their empire. So even though it wasn't the Greeks, Rome still carried on Hellenism. So some key features. The language is Koine Greek, which is what the Bible, the New Testament, is written in. It's not the same Greek that's spoken today. It's an old Greek, kind of like we don't speak Old English today. The same thing with Greek. And so it is Koine Greek. It was the common language among the Mediterranean period, including the New Testament. There's education and philosophy, which focused on the rhetoric and literature, reason and philosophical schools, kind of like Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism. All those isms that we hear nowadays came from the Hellenism. We also have urban life, which led to gymnasiums, theaters, marketplaces, and public baths. I don't want to know what that's like. But these were like the center of their life. We see religion with Greek gods being multiple and when often merged with local religions. And we see the Greeks came first. And if you look at Greek mythology and Roman mythology, it is quite similar. That's how you can tell Romans took over Hellenism and kept it, but they changed it because they wanted their own thing. And then it was a very individualistic culture. They focused more on personal achievement and fame, which contrasted from the Hebrew culture of a community covenant. Now, everybody was under one promise. With Hellenism, everyone wanted their own glory. And we actually will see that in these different groups when we get into the Jewish groups. We'll see they kind of share this individualistic culture. So some positive impacts on Judaism from Hellenism is that we have the Septuagint. It's a translation, it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which made Jewish scriptures accessible to all types. Because this is multiple years after the Old Testament. There might be some Jews that have no idea what Hebrew is like. They've probably never read Hebrew, but they know Greek. And so this translation of the Bible being into Greek allows these Jews to read it. But it also helps us nowadays translate the Bible better. We have a culture exchange. Some Jewish thinkers like Philo of Alexandria use Greek philosophy to explain and defend the Jewish faith. If they wouldn't have this, it would be another set of apologetics defending the Bible. If I could find another way to defend the Bible, I'd use it. And so these Jews used this Greek culture to defend the Bible. And then diaspora synagogues, diaspora being the spread of the Jews outside of Jerusalem. They had synagogues because they weren't able to get back to Jerusalem. So they had to they had to worship somewhere. Well, here's these synagogues. Here's these different churches that these people can go to and worship when they're outside of Jerusalem. Some negative impacts, though, it's a religious compromise. See, the Jews embraced Greek customs, gymnasium sports, well, the Olympics, Greek dress, and pagan festivals. They would worship these gods, these idols, and they would compromise their own faith. It led to the Maccabean revolt. We talked about this last week, but it's the Antiochus IV Epiphanes talks, does these horrible things, which came from Hellenism, and it impacted Judaism and even Christianity negatively. And then the division of Jewish society. Hellenized Jews accepted Greek culture, so we'll see sometimes in different writings Hellenized Jews and Jews. These are two different groups. They're not the same because these Hellenized Jews take Greek culture and they add it to their Jewish religion. We can't do that. We can't take something of a different culture and add it to our religion. It's not the same. Now, influence on the New Testament world. Language and communication was a whole lot easier. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, and then the gospel was easier to tell to everybody because everybody knew Greek. World nowadays, everybody's starting to learn English. It's the same way. Everybody had to know Greek back then. And so everybody knew this language that the New Testament would be written in. It was a good influence on cities and missionary work. We have major cities like Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Alexandria, which were huge cities, kind of like our modern day New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, these huge cities with so many people that we will then later see Paul, Peter, Jesus, all these big people, influencers of the Christian religion coming in and spreading the gospel through these major cities that were only accessible because the Greeks made them. We have philosophy and apologetics. Early Christian thinkers engaged in Greek philosophy. Acts 17, Paul addresses Stoic and Epicurean philosophers at Mars Hill in Athens. Fun fact, I've been there. I stood where he was talking. One of the greatest things ever. But it puts it into realization. Oh, not that. It puts it in my head that it actually happened. When you get to go to these places where these things happen, it comes out real. I could read it in a book all the time. It might not come off real to me until I get to go to Athens, stand where Paul stood, see where Paul looked. And so I highly recommend it. But I was able to stand there and see the message he gave to these philosophers. And then also concepts like logos, the word. John 1, in the beginning was logos, and in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. Logos, logos, logos. That came from Greek philosophy. We also have religious pluralism. The Hellenistic world was full of competing religions, cultures, and philosophies, creating both challenges and opportunities for Christian influence. It's always good when someone believes something else when you try to talk to them about the Bible. If they believe in the Bible, then they might have misconceptions. But if they don't believe in the Bible at all, you can actually teach them. And so it was very easy for them to talk about Scripture, even though they believe different things. And then Roman Hellenistic infrastructure. The Roman Empire adopted Greek culture, as I said, but they added law and road systems, enabling the rapid spread of Christianity, as we talked about last week with all the Roman roads that they created. Very easy travel. So now, I hinted to it last week. This is probably one of the coolest things and saddest things we're going to talk about. The abomination of desolation, perfectly prophesied in Scripture. There's multiple different appearances that we'll see in Daniel of this abomination of desolation. I'm not going to go through and read them because we don't have that much time. But I definitely recommend going back. Daniel 8, 9 to 14, 9:27, 11:31, and 12:11. All of those we will see in our history books exactly how it happened. But what does abomination of desolation mean? Well, it's two words. Abomination meaning something detestable to God. And we see this Hebrew word used in 1 Kings 11, 5 to 7. And there's other places, even in the New Testament, that uses the word abomination. Something detestable. When we are, it's not abomination. Or no, yeah, it is abomination. When we are lukewarm, we are an abomination to God. We are detestable to God. Same meaning. And then desolation, a devastation or a desecration, especially of holy places. So the abomination of desolation was something detestable that desecrated the holy place, the temple. So historical fulfillment, we're going to go through everything that happened with this and, that it was fulfilled in Scripture. But Antiochus IV Epiphanes was the leader of this abomination. Well, he reigned 175 to 164 BC as the king of Seleucid Empire, aggressive Hellenization. He called himself Epiphanius, which means God manifest. You want to know what the Jews called him, though? The madman. He's crazy. It's kind of like we might call some leaders nowadays a little crazy. But we see Antiochus thought he was God. The Jews thought he was crazy. He was crazy. He's not God. But he wanted to take the temple for himself. So some events that are leading up to it, because he doesn't just randomly do this. From 168 to 167 BC, he was trying to turn and capture Egypt from the Romans, but then the Romans took Egypt. And Antiochus took his anger out on Jerusalem and the Jews. So he started outlawing certain religious practices. He banned circumcision. The Sabbath observance was forbidden. Possession of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. If you had that, you're put to death. Even if you didn't even open it or read it, if you had it, you're dead. So this was even before any of the abominations. And then he decided to dedicate the temple to Zeus. So now we get to the abomination. In December of 167 BC, Antiochus ordered for an altar of Zeus to be erected into the temple and for sacrifices of unclean animals, especially pigs, on the altar in the temple. And if you know anything about Leviticus, you know pigs are the most unclean animals. And he sacrificed it on an altar that was for God. That's the abomination. He desecrated the temple so that it could never be used again. Because you can't clean a temple. You can't clean an altar. Levitical law cannot allow you to do that. And this is the only temple they had at this time. And so, what do? You don't do anything. It's terrible. But how did the Jews respond? We see a Maccabean revolt. And we talked about that. But then in 164 BC, the temple was rededicated. Don't know exactly how. They probably tore down the altar and built a new one. But it was rededicated, and that's where we get the the holiday of Hanukkah. Is to honor this event of the rededication of the temple. Most likely, yes. Antiochus most likely died before then. Yeah, most likely, because he probably would have just desecrated it again. So he was probably dead when that happened. But so, what's the significance of this? How does it change Jewish and even Christian thought? Well, in Daniel's time, when it was prophesied, it was a prophecy. This is not going to happen anytime soon, so let's not deal with it. Let's just push it off. It will eventually happen. In Jewish history, it was fulfillment. Daniel said exactly how it was going to happen, and it happened. Maybe we should have probably listened to what he said. Maybe we should have probably listened to God. Maybe we should have been faithful to God, and that would have happened. Questions they probably were asking. But in Jesus' teachings, and we see it in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, it was a foreshadow. See, Jesus said that something like this would happen again. And this is often interpreted as the Romans destroying the second temple, the one in Jerusalem, on AD 70. And that even affects the New Testament scriptures that we have. And it also helps us with knowing when they were written. We know Mark was written first because of the destruction of the temple. We know Matthew and Luke were written before. We know that John was written afterwards because he mentions this. And so we even can see through this dating that some of the scriptures were written before the destruction and some were written afterwards. But Jesus was foreshadowing this destruction, or what we think he was foreshadowing. So what's some key takeaways for this abomination and desolation? Well, we know that it was a fulfillment, and it was a desecration of the second temple. It was going to happen because Daniel said, and God was already putting it in place before it even happened. It symbolized the forced replacement of Judaism for Hellenism. The Jews weren't going to give it up, but Antiochus forced them to give it up. And then the event became the central example of blasphemy and persecution in the Jewish memory. They were influenced later on by prophetic and apocalyptic thought because they thought this would happen again. And so it was huge for the Jewish cultures. And then the Maccabean revolt is going to lead to the next thing. Jewish religious groups. And the actual word is sects. But I cannot ever say that word correctly, and it sounds like something else when I do say it. So I'm just not going to say it. I'm just going to call them groups because I don't want that on YouTube. But the first one we're going to talk about is the Pharisees. So some background about it. When did it start? Well, it originated around the Maccabean period. This was when the Jews, revolted, took over, and then they start changing. This group wants certain things. This group wants certain things. This group wants to follow this. This group believes this. And so that's when all these groups started to form. So the Pharisees, they originated in this time, and they were actually a lay movement dedicated to preserving Jewish identity under foreign rule. They wanted to make sure the Jewish culture stayed where it was. They're named after the Hebrew word Purushim, which is separated ones, because they wanted to be separated from impurity and Gentile influence. They were the holier-than-thou people. They wanted to be far away from all the impurities of the world. But by the New Testament era, they were the most influential Jewish group. And we even see in Scripture they could influence Roman law and change what they wanted when they wanted it. So what did they believe? They believed in the entire Old Testament. They used the law, the prophets, and the different writings. They used all of it. They held oral tradition equal to the law. That's completely wrong. What we think, our traditions, are nowhere equal to the Bible. Which we see that in Mark 3 and Mark 7. They believed in the resurrection of the dead, angels, and spirits, and even in a waiting place, a purgatory. Not the same way that Catholics believe. but they believed in that. They stressed the observance of the law. They wanted to keep the law. They went away from all impurity, so they wanted to keep the law. And they were respected by the people for their piety, their religiousness. But Jesus rebuked their hypocrisy. See, they thought they were, holier than thou. They were the most religious Jews ever. But Jesus comes in and says, no, you're not. You're all the way down here. That's what tradition can do to your faith. So in the New Testament, they were often opposed Jesus for healing on the Sabbath, eating with sinners, and not following their traditions. Nicodemus is a Pharisee. Paul was a Pharisee. But then after AD 70, Pharisaic Judaism started the rabbinic Judaism. Rabbis and those people started to lead the Jews. There were rabbis, teachers, Darren, but it really really changed and spread, and there were more rabbis after AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. So now the Sadducees. You always hear the joke, oh goodness, this slipped my mind now, but, why was the Jew crying? Because he was sad, you see. Yeah. But the Sadducees, some background, they most likely originated from priestly and aristocratic classes during the Hasmonean period, or the Maccabean period. They named after Zadok, which was a high priest under Solomon. I don't know where you get Sadducee from Zadok, but it was probably one of his names, one of his last names. But he was the high priest, and so they wanted to be named after him. Because they controlled the temple and the priests, and they had the Sanhedrin majority before AD 70. Their beliefs, they only accepted the Torah. So everything after Deuteronomy was thrown out. They only wanted what Moses wrote. They didn't pay attention for Psalms. They didn't pay attention to the minor and major prophets or any of the wisdom literature. They didn't like it. They only wanted the law. They denied the resurrection of the dead, angels, and spirits. They thought that doesn't exist. It's only God and it's only the Father. They didn't believe anything else. They only thought it was the Father. They were also cooperative with Rome. They maintained their power and influence by kind of helping out the Romans. But then they also focused on sacrifices and temple worship. It seems a little weird. They didn't believe in all the, things that God did in the Old Testament. But they believed in sacrifices and temple worship. It's a little weird. But in the New Testament, we see they also clashed with Jesus over resurrection teaching. They worked with the Pharisees to oppose Jesus. But then after the temple was destroyed, they disappeared. They were gone. No trace of what happened to them. And it's probably because their authority was temple-based. So if the temple's not there, they got no authority, and then gone. All right. Next one is the Essenes. Now, this is not well known because there's no mention in the New Testament of the Essenes. We don't know why, but we know that Josephus, Philo, and even the Dead Sea Scrolls mention this group. They likely emerged around the 2nd century BC as a separatist group opposed to the Hasmonean priesthood. I think of them as kind of like monks. They wanted to keep to themselves. They wanted to do what they wanted and kept away from all the others. Many scholars associate them with the Qumran community, and that community actually preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it kind of makes sense for a group of Jews to be preserving scripture, that's the Old Testament, and other writings that deal with things in the Old Testament. Maybe, we don't really know, but it's a possibility. So some beliefs, they had extreme purity laws, which kind of leads me to thinking like they're monks because they had like the little bitty things they needed to stay pure of. And they were also separating themselves from the corrupt temple priesthood in Jerusalem. They studied scripture intensely. We talked about, at Polishing the Pulpit, they talked about scribes and how they would have one book and they would study it and they would write it and they would copy it and it became their book. They loved the book. The Essenes were just like that. They studied the scripture intensely every single day, 9 to 5. It was their job to study these scriptures. They practiced communal living, more kind of monk style. And they believed, and they were very apocalyptic. They believed that they were living in the end times and they were waiting for God's final victory over evil. They thought, oh, it could happen tomorrow. It's probably going to happen tomorrow. Oh, tomorrow came. It's going to happen tomorrow. They're that like dead set on the end times are soon. In the New Testament, not mentioned, but there's possibly a similarity with John the Baptist's wilderness lifestyle. They thought, scholars think that his lifestyle in the wilderness might have been similar to that of the Essene lifestyle. Now, my favorites. I love the Zealots. The Zealots are awesome. So some background for the Zealots. They emerged in 1st century AD, so kind of after the Intertestamental Period, but still caused because of the Intertestamental Period. They're rooted in Maccabean spirit of resistance. They wanted to resist everybody. They didn't care. And they're called zealots because they reflect zeal for God's law. So some beliefs. They believed that God was their only king, and they refused to pay taxes and refused to do anything for the Romans. Do not refuse to pay taxes, because that would be bad. But they refused back then to pay taxes, and because they only believed God was their king, and no other God stands before him. They were very violent. They were, often armed, and we'll talk about a specific group in a little bit, but often armed and are going around with swords all around Rome. And they would often rebel against Rome. So in the New Testament, we see Simon, the zealot, one of Jesus' apostles, was a zealot. And then they revolted in AD 66 to 70, which then led to the destruction of Jerusalem. And yeah, it's the zealots. There was a group of zealots that were in the temple when the Romans were coming, and they thought it would be better for them to die by themselves than rather have a Roman kill them. So then that led to all these zealots dying in the temple, mass suicide. That's how dead set on not letting any Roman control my life, that they didn't even want to be killed by them. So now we get to the Sicarii. The Sicarii is a zealot subgroup. They are a group of radical zealots. They're probably one of the coolest because they're known as dagger men. Sicarii stands for dagger men. So they're very radical. This was a coin that is believed the Sicarii would have had. And to know that you're a Sicarii, you pull out this coin and show it, kind of like a police officer pulls out his badge. It's kind of the same thing. So all Sicarii would have most likely had this coin. And they would have most likely had a blade called a sika, or a short curved dagger that they would reveal and conceal in their cloaks. Their tactics, they practiced political and publicly assassinated people, especially targets of, they especially targeted Jews that sided with Rome and even Roman leaders. Josephus even records them killing priests and Roman supporters. Now, if you ever play a game called Assassin's Creed, this is going to pop out to you. And it's crazy that even a game that's not even supposed to be related to the Bible is related to the Bible. Assassin's Creed, you're part of an assassin's group, and you have a blade called a hidden blade that would be concealed in your cloak that you go around and commit public assassinations because they were hurting your people. They were part of the leaders, the corrupted leaders of whatever region you are in the game. And they would go and publicly assassinate these corrupt leaders. It's just, it happened in real life. The Sicarii were real. So in the New Testament, they're not directly mentioned in Scripture, but Paul is accused of leading a rebellion of 4,000 assassins. Now, out of all the translations I looked at, including the NIV, which translates it as terrorist, the first letter is capitalized, showing a proper noun. It's an actual group. These assassins were a group, most likely the Sicarii. Now, don't have any evidence for that, but I'd like to believe that if something's capitalized, it's got to be a group, and the only group of assassins during that time were the Sicarii. So now the Samaritans. The Samaritans in the New Testament are not the same as the ones in the Old Testament. Just want to let you know, they're not the same. See, Old Testament Samaria, the capital, it was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. It was destroyed by the Assyrians in 772 BC, which then, the population was deported, and the foreigners started resettling there. So they're bringing in people that aren't Jews or aren't Samaritans into the city of Samaria. And with these foreigners would intermarry with Israelites, making mixed groups, which then leads into what we have as the New Testament. See, these Samaritans are not Jews. They have Jewish descent, but they are not Jews because they do not follow the Jewish culture. So Old Testament, primarily Israelite inhabitants. But in the New Testament, they are ethnically mixed descendants. So not the same. They are connected, but they're not the same. So what did these New Testament Samaritans believe? They only accepted the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They believed that you could only worship at Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem. They practiced their own version of the Mosaic Law, which was based on the Samaritan Pentateuch, which was different than what we have. And they observed their own religious calendar and feast. So it was nothing compared to the Jews, which is nothing compared to the Samaritans of the Old Testament, because the Samaritans of the Old Testament are Jews. So they're not the same. So in the New Testament, they have hostility with the Jews, and it was very deep. Jesus broke barriers by speaking to the Samaritan woman and making a Samaritan the hero of one of his parables. In Acts, the Samaritans received the gospel through Philip. And this is what we see of the Samaritans. So now the Sanhedrin. The origins of the Sanhedrin go all the way back to the Council of Elders in ancient Israel, especially when these 70 elders appointed by Moses to assist him in judging and ruling over the people. And we see that in Numbers 11. The name Sanhedrin means assembly or council. By the Intertestamental Period, IP, the Sanhedrin developed into a government and a council. They would make decisions. They would, take people to jail. They'd do all this under the Greek and later Roman rule. Historians often credit the Hasmonean period for all these changes in the Sanhedrin. So the purpose of it originally was to interpret and enforce the Torah. They made legal rulings as well and oversee temple matters and even deal with religious disputes. Now, they couldn't deal with everything because under Roman rule, they were an autonomous religious court, but anything that had to do with the death penalty, like Jesus, had to be approved by the Romans, which is in John 18:31. So how did it work? Well, the structure of it is kind of similar to our political structure nowadays. There's 71 members, and that consists of one high priest, other priests or Sadducees, scribes and Pharisees, and then different elders. These were respected community leaders. But this mix, as you can probably guess, led to a lot of disputes and zero actual rulings going through because they couldn't agree. The location of the Sanhedrin, they met in the Hall of Hewn Stone, which was in the temple in Jerusalem. And that's what people think that it looked like. Their jurisdiction and authority, they oversaw Jewish law, religious observance, and some political affairs, some under Roman oversight. They could issue arrest, so they sent officers to seize Jesus and even hold trials, as we see in Acts 6-7 with Stephen. I'm about to call him Stephen. Stephen. They could recommend capital punishment, but they could not actually give capital punishment. But as we see in the New Testament, this was definitely violated. So how did the trials function? Well, every proceeding had to require witnesses. You have to have a witness. And they typically met during the day and made decisions on a different day. That's not what they did with Jesus. They met at night and made the decision on the same day. I mean, any politician nowadays, or any, judge would throw this case out. Because there's no, they went against all the laws. So who are some people that we see in the Bible that are in the Sanhedrin? Well, we have Caiaphas. He was the high priest at the time of Jesus' trial. We have Annas, which was the former high priest, but definitely an influential figure and even the father-in-law to Caiaphas. Nicodemus, who is the guy that met Jesus at night. Joseph of Arimathea, Jesus was buried in his tomb. Gamaliel, he was the teacher of Paul, and he was also a Pharisee. Now, this next one, we don't really know. But if you know him, you would probably think he was Paul. See, we don't really know. It never says if he actually was in the Sanhedrin. But he had the authority to arrest Christians. And so some scholars think that he was either being prepared or even connected to the Sanhedrin. I mean, Gamaliel was his teacher, so he might have been connected to the Sanhedrin. Some biblical references to the Sanhedrin. We have Matthew 26:57. That's Jesus before the council. We have his trial before the Sanhedrin. We have the council questioning Jesus. We have the Sanhedrin plotting to kill Jesus. We have Peter and John before the council. We have Stephen's trials. And we even have Paul before the Sanhedrin. So what happened to the Sanhedrin? They lost authority under Roman rule, which this led to this happened because of different tensions between Jewish leaders. The Jewish revolt, which then led to basically all the groups disappearing, which then there's no Sanhedrin. And then the destruction of the temple. This led to sacrifices stopping. There's no such thing as priesthood anymore, and even the Sadducees eventually disappeared. I think I can get through this. Okay, so other writings. Septuagint. That's a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and this included many different apocryphal books. Targums, which was the Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible, and this even had some similar ideas to apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found in Qumran in the 1940s, 1950s, they included biblical manuscripts, the Apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, and different sectarian works. I'll skip over that. Okay, rabbinic literature, these are just short little things. Mishnah, Talmud, Midrashim emerged after 200 AD but referred back to the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. So what's the Apocrypha? It comes from apokryphos, which is hidden or secret. It's a collection of Jewish writings from the intertestamental period, and it is found in the Septuagint. Now, why is it not in our Bible? Canonical status. Well, the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox include it as deuterocanonical, which is kind of the second canon in the Old Testament. And then Protestants exclude them. They do not include them, but they were included in the 1611, the year 1611, King James Version. What's the purpose? Well, they're very valuable for historical context, moral lessons, and theological reflection for the period of the IP, Intertestamental Period. And then the books, I'll just run through these. Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and then other additions to Esther and Daniel, like the prayer of Azariah and Bel and the dragon. So, pseudepigrapha comes from two Greek words, pseudos, which is false, and epigraphen, which is to inscribe. So these are false writings under a different name. They come around 200 BC to 200 AD, and they often claim authorship by ancient patriarchs, prophets, and even kings. They were never part of Jewish or Christian canon. They're never part of the Bible because they're not authorized by God. The purpose is not to deceit, but to teach people. They use these big names and these names that people would know, so that way people would actually read and learn from their writings. If it was their names, they would just set it to the side. They offer insight into Jewish thought, messianic expectations, and apocalyptic beliefs. So different books, we see first Enoch, which is Enoch from Genesis 5, Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, Jubilees, Assumptions of Moses, Ascension of Isaiah, and Psalms of Solomon. So why do these matter? I know I kind of ran through that fast, but why do these matter? Well, they give historical background. They bridge the gap of the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. These are writings that the Jews were reading, and they bridged the gap between. They might not have been inspired, but they were good to read and learn from. It shows us the religious development and the evolution of Jewish theology with angels, resurrection, messianic hope, and even judgment. And there are some New Testament quotations and connections. Jude 14 to 15 directly quotes from first Enoch. And then Hebrews, Revelation, and other books reflects ideas that are found in this literature. And then cultural influence. They help explain the beliefs of these groups like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, and why they believed the way that they believed. So now New Testament Judaism. We started with the old, and we're getting in with the new. There's definitely changes. Multiple competing groups started to form. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots now started to form where they used to not. Synagogue worship didn't exist in the Old Testament, now it does. There's different places for them to now worship. Oral tradition and legalism started to come and take over where the law was. They didn't really follow oral tradition back when the Old Testament was created. So now that's different. They're starting to follow what other people believe rather than what the Old Testament said. And then Roman political influence. High priest became a politically appointed spot. They were no longer just chosen by God, while they were chosen by the people. And they were also manipulated. And we see that in John 11. So to conclude, I know there was a whole lot of information I threw at you. And so if you want, I will give you my notes. But to summarize, the intertestamental period created deep divisions, but also prepared the stage for the gospel. And the application for us nowadays is that we need to recognize how culture and conflict shape faith communities today. And we can be shaped by our traditions. We can be shaped by other religions. We can be shaped by what somebody said that's not according to the Bible. But we need to watch out for that. We can't let tradition get in our way. We can't let tradition stop us from changing, because sometimes it's good to change. So here's a challenge for you. In a world of religious factions, will we focus on God's truth or on human traditions? Think back to all the things that we do. What's tradition? The order of worship? Tradition. How many songs we sing? Tradition. If we're in a building or if we're in a tent? Tradition. If we open the Bible or if we just know it by heart? Tradition. See, there's a lot of things that we have that are tradition. And do we let it shape what we do? Do we get mad if we don't sing 2 songs before the Lord's Supper? Do we get mad if we have more than one prayer at the beginning? Do we get mad if somebody speaks a little longer? It's all tradition. Not to call anybody out, but it's tradition. And so we need to focus in on what's tradition and what's the Bible. Dad, can you lead us? Can you end us in prayer?